Empire at War and its expansion, Forces of Corruption, went through many changes during development which resulted in the removal of units, heroes, planets, and even entire game mechanics. Some of these bits of content are only known from small references left in the files, but others are enabled in the game to varying degrees. The Forces of Corruption expansion even fully enabled some, like the Venator and the V-Wing fighter, both of which had only been recently introduced to Star Wars when the game had come out. While there were full models and code created for them, they're only set up to appear in an unplayable Galactic Conquest campaign seemingly meant as a demo template and known by the awe-inspiring name P7 in the code. In Forces of Corruption, they were added to the Merchant Space Dock in Skirmish for the new Zan Consortium faction, so they at least got some use out of the models. Of course, modders, on basically the first day of Empire at War's release, had already enabled them in varying ways for different factions. Other units tended to be far less complete, leaving behind only individual art assets, notes in the code, or stray text threads. For example, the text file for the game includes a reference to an HRB team, an entirely unused string which I assume stands for Heavy Repeating Blaster in an infantry team, which may have been intended for a unit based on the Imperial E-Web turrets. The Tartan patrol cruiser, introduced as an Imperial anti-fighter corvette for the game, also references in its code that it was originally intended to be the well-established Carrack-class cruiser. If you look at the designs, you can definitely see some similarities between the engine block and the bridge windows especially, just with wildly different proportions. So if I had to guess, I'd say they started making the design for the Carrack, then realized it was too different and renamed it. Weirdly enough, the most complete cut unit aside from the Venator and the V-Wing was actually a different type of indigenous unit, an alternate model for the Pingani, who are the indigenous units on Polis. This model would have turned them all into penguins instead of just being bland, boring humans like they ended up in the game. This one's especially tragic since a Pingani Jedi Master was introduced in the Darth Bane novels after they were introduced in Empire at War, so instead of having our 7 millionth human-looking Jedi, we could have had a Penguin Jedi Master, which is indisputably way better. The text files also point to a significantly wider array of planets than were in the original game, including some big established names from the expanded universe like Duro, Gamor, Hapes, Luek, and Trindosha, which also have text referencing various types of different indigenous species. These could have also been turned into units in the game, like they did with the Wookiees and Ewoks, although sadly unlike what they did with that nice penguin model. It's worth noting that not every planet with a referenced species ends up having a modeled playable version of it though. For example, Munilinst, which was added in Forces of Corruption, lists the Muns as a local inhabitant, yet they weren't made for the game, and the loading screen for the planet shows them as just regular humans. This may have been the result of an even more compressed development cycle for Forces of Corruption compared to the base game. While we don't have any evidence of assets for indigenous forces on these planets, the game does include models for several of these planets themselves intended for use either on the galactic map or in space tactical battles. One of the planets, Ratatak, even has a very early work-in-progress map included in Forces of Corruption. Those greedy modders have often included a slightly upgraded version of it in different mods, but it is a pretty rough map, so there's not really all that much to work with there. The expanded roster of planets in the text and art assets were joined by an expanded roster of heroes, and both of these factors, along with some of the cut features, point to an original intent for the game to resemble the older Star Wars 4X Rebellion, aka Supremacy in the UK, a bit more closely. On the Rebel side, General Carlos Rican is in the text files and described as buffing small forces, seeming like he was closely tied to the Rebel raiding mechanic. General Yondo Donna from Episode 4 is included as well, and he even has a model. His text says he gives a morale boost and has the Find Weakness ability, both of which ultimately became traits of Admiral Akbar, so he may have been cut for being redundant. Since the game is set before the Battle of Yavin, it's also possible that Akbar wasn't originally planned to be included. Luke Skywalker does exist in the game as a space hero leading Red Squadron for the Rebels, but he does have some text and XML code indicating a potential intended use as a ground hero at some point, prior to his inclusion in his Episode 6 form for Forces of Corruption. He does have a model as well, though this is for the medal ceremony in the final cinematic, and the animation set used for him here seems to just be the infiltrator animations pasted on, giving him death animations which heroes typically don't use in the game. Leia similarly has a model wearing her dress for that ceremony, but she does also have text with her name, though it's misspelled, referencing her as an active hero unit. Unlike Luke, Forces of Corruption never expanded her role and she stays a background reference. The Final Cut Rebel hero was a fully modeled and animated infiltrator hero named Tani Abila, a new character for the game who combined a few abilities later used for C-3PO and R2, as well as infiltrator heroes like Han and the skirmish-only Kyle Katarn. The Rebel text stealing seemed largely based on her originally, with a bunch of text referring to different respawn timers and success or failure states for the text stealing missions, compared to the automatic successes for using the pair of droids and later iterations. There's a Barlaw's freighter model in the game which is unused, though with its model being named the Shadow Claw, my guess is that this was intended as a unique space unit for her, much like how the Millennium Falcon works for Han and Chewie. Me connecting it to her is mostly based on the fact that it's Shadow Claw and she looks like a cat, and cats have claws as well. She looks a lot like a Cathar, best known as the species of Juhani in Knights of the Old Republic, but given her name matching Bothan naming conventions, for her last name at least, and her being involved in text stealing for the Rebels, I think she may have been intended as a Bothan. The game does include a standard Bothan design, but these are mostly males, so it's possible during her concept phase something got confused somewhere, and maybe they just thought Juhani was what a female Bothan looked like. Most planned Imperial heroes sadly didn't go beyond the short text mentions with a little information on any unique abilities. These are an Inquisitor named Antonis Tremaine and a TIE pilot named Lieutenant Tambris. There is a text string where the name of the text string looks like it's for Admiral Ozzel, but the actual text used by the string calls him Admiral Dalkin Hole. This is only used in a kidnapping corruption mission on Karita for the Underworld, and I assume it was only changed because the game takes place after Ozzel's death. Where things get more interesting are on the scum and villainy side. Dengar, a bounty hunter from Episode 5, has text saying he can be hired by any faction, though he has no model or texture. Two other bounty hunters, Zuckuss and Forlom, are also mentioned in the text with next to no information, though based on the expanded universe they may have been intended as Rebel counterparts to Boba Fett, so I may have lied about Tani being the last Rebel one we talk about. The most complete unused hero, after Tani, is the leader of the Black Sun Pirates, Prince Shizor, who has a unique model and animation set, and in my opinion is probably one of the best character models in the game. He does get used for a hologram video and story reference in Forces of Corruption, though his model is never used as an actual in-game unit in either Empire at War or Forces of Corruption, which really is unfortunate given the model's quality. Beyond this kind of content, other mechanics seem to have changed substantially over time or been cut entirely. There's some hints of deeper faction management and even alliances within the code, though what exactly the alliances would be between, considering it's just the Empire and Rebels, is unclear. There are mentions of faction coding for the Ewoks and the Wookiees, so it's possible the alliance mechanic would be for gaining or losing the loyalty of that kind of indigenous unit, rather than having them all support a fixed side, which would also explain why the faction code has a line for allied and enemy factions. This works fine in tactical battles, but you tend to have a lot of issues on the galactic level if you set two factions to be allied there. A lot of this was possibly either getting too complex for the intended depth of the galactic map, or they just ran out of time and couldn't go any further with these kinds of mechanics. It's the kind of thing that probably would have required a lot of extra work per planet and would have distracted from finishing other more core content in the game, so it's understandable why this didn't get more focus. Structure building did get a rework at some point though too. By the time the game was released, in space you'd upgrade one main structure line with a couple extra types of structures you could place on top of that, and on ground you would have a bunch of different structures filling different slots. But originally, the ground building was a lot more similar to space. You had a command center that you'd upgrade from level 1 to level 5. The models for both the Rebel and Imperial version of this are both still in the game. The other possibility is that Galactic Conquest never included this, but it was used for skirmish at some point, so I really can't say that that would have been the plan with absolute certainty, but the assets being present do support it being used at least somewhere. There's one additional tactical mechanic which is actually still present in the game, but which isn't really something players will often notice, and which I assume had bigger uses originally: energy pools for ships. All ships in Empire at War have a hidden energy resource, which never gets mentioned in the game, but using weapons or being hit by ion cannons will reduce this pool. This can sort of stun ships in a way that's different from the more direct built-in stuns from the planetary ion weapon or the Y-Wing's ion shot ability, which players definitely notice. Whether or not energy was intended for a broader purpose, there are other lines in unit code which aren't seemingly used for anything, and which do imply other galactic mechanics going on, or tactical mechanics. There are lines for squadron and transport capacity which imply that the construction and movement of fighters and maybe even ground units would have been different at some point, and there's also a political control line in each unit. Political control is actually an element of planets that does still exist. When you capture a planet at Empire at War, you'll notice that your credits on the galactic map on that planet will slowly count up from 0 to the full amount. This is because the planet is slowly gaining political control for your faction. And in my opinion, the political control line being on other XML objects like the units points to it being intended, much like energy, for a broader purpose in the game, with control swinging back and forth based on different factors. It'd be really interesting if Petroglyph someday gets the chance to make Empire at War 2 and potentially expand on some of this content. But there is at least one bit of content that was cut between Empire at War and the expansion Forces of Corruption. There were a few things which were unintentionally broken, like the guard and stop commands on units, reflections in water, and a few other things, some of which have been fixed in patches, but it did also intentionally cut a specific feature. Rancors in the base game of Empire at War were able to pick up and eat infantry while they were fighting. This ability is commented out in the code in Forces of Corruption, noting that it was a, quote, censorship issue, which is why you sadly can't zoom in and see Rancors having lunch anymore. But that's really easy to turn back on for yourself if you really want to. This seems like a weird thing for them to be forced to cut, considering the game was able to include a unit which was just a guy with a bag full of Ewoks who are, don't forget, sentient beings, and there were a bunch of bombs strapped to their chest. These Ewoks are then used to bomb enemy targets. I think that's a bit worse than the Rancors eating people. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this video on some of the cut content from Empire at War and Forces of Corruption. Let me know in the comments what your favorite bit of cut content from the game was. Sometime soon, I'd also like to do a version of this about the content we've had to cut from the Empire at War expanded mods over the years. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.